Now, we have three wonderful historians here today. Diarmaid Ferriter, Anne Dolan and Gearóid O'Tuathaigh. And Gearóid is going to be daddy, he's in charge, so I need to tell you something about him. He's Professor Emeritus in History and former Dean of Arts and Vice President of this august institution, NUI Galway. He's one of Ireland's most eminent historians with a broad range of interests from the 18th to the 20th centuries. The author of Ireland Before the Famine, 1798 to 1848, Email on Voice, The Great Famine and the Language Shift in 19th Century Ireland, and with his great friend Joe Lee, The Age of Devil Era. He was a beloved teacher, and many students have cause to be grateful to him for his inspiration, advice and support. He was appointed to the Council of State by the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, in 2012. So he's not just a great historian, he's a very important person and recognised as such by our President. So he's going to introduce you to Diarmaid and Anne, and they're going to have what we know would be a scintillating conversation about that other conversation 100 years ago. Gearóid, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katrina. And as our time is a fixed time, I'm sure neither Diarmaid nor Anne require lengthy introductions. They're both, they count among two of the most distinguished historians of modern Ireland and certainly of the revolutionary period. Their publications, a long list from here to the Treaty Stone, as we say in Limerick, a list of publications from here to the Treaty Stone. I will not even begin to recite some of them. Safe to say that they are both sharply intellectual in terms of their reading of stuff, but based in the archives. They are both archive-based historians who have the ultimate, follow the ultimate, as it were, advice of any historian, ad fontes, to the sources, and that is what informs their work and what makes them so distinguished. Now, we won't dally. When the Anglo-Irish Treaty comes up for consideration in general audiences as well as in audiences that are well informed, it seems to me that very frequently it's framed in terms of what it led to. It led to a split in the Popular Front Republican Sinn Féin movement. It led to an acrimonious and divisive split in the Dáil. It led to a bitter civil war, which in turn led to the shape of Irish politics and bitterness in civil life as well as in everything else. It led to all of these things. And on the other hand, the benign version of it is that it led to the establishment of a stable, in European terms, a remarkably stable parliamentary democracy, one of the most stable of the early 20th century. It led ultimately to the Republic of Ireland as a fully sovereign state, which even as we are assembled here today, chairs the Security Council of the United Nations, no less, as it were, in international terms. And that it led, as Collins forecast, the freedom to achieve freedom. Now, that's the shorthand for very often that allows people to talk about it. I thought we might just very briefly at the start of our conversation today, just roll it back in a different way and say what led to it rather than what it led to. And very specifically, as it were the parties to the Anglo-Irish Treaty equally anxious for a settlement? Were they equally prepared for compromise? And if so, what were the prospects before anybody was sent to London or before anybody sat down at all? What do you think, what led to it, or from the truce onwards? Would anyone like to take it up?
Well, I think if you begin with what happens in July 1921, there's a truce, okay? We don't need to go through all of the War of Independence. It raises the prospect of what political solution might be possible, or if there is a political solution possible. What does that mean on both sides? What does it mean for Sinn Féin? What does it mean for the British government? The context for the British government there, you're talking about were they after a settlement. David Lloyd George was after a settlement. He used those very words. You know, we are after a settlement. That is our objective. What might that involve from the British side? Be conscious that it's a British Prime Minister who's heading a coalition government, a liberal conservative government. He has to be very mindful of the nature and texture of that government and the enemies within. Who have very strong views on Ireland. Some of their minds, of course, are saturated in imperialism. But there are also pragmatists who want to get the hell out of Ireland because it's become an expensive nuisance and it's causing them a lot of problems in terms of the public profile of the Irish question. And there's a Peace with Ireland Council, there's pressure from the trade unions. You know, there are various things going on for David Lloyd George. On the Irish side, there's the question of what happens. You know, if you take that moment when the truce is announced, what does it mean for the soldiers? What does it mean for the politicians? You know, when the news of the truce is delivered to the IRA, they don't know what's coming next. And a lot of them are not kept informed of what's going on. Some could announce that it was a signal victory in itself, that they had got the Brits to agree to a truce, but others were not so sure. And then the question is, when you look at the summer of 1921, and what might be possible. De Valera goes to David Lloyd George. I mean, it happens very quickly. They have a meeting. There are red lines established very early on. Empire. You know, empire is not up for negotiation. You have to remain within the empire. De Valera is talking, of course, about the right of Irish people to decide on something else. Jan Smuts gets involved, who's the Prime Minister of the South African Union, and he writes to De Valera from London because he's involved, you know, tangentially in this. And he says, to you, the true expression of nationhood is a republic, but it's not the only expression of nationhood, and you have to be mindful of your more powerful neighbours. So the question, that goes to the nub of it. I mean, what is the true expression of nationhood for Sinn Féin? De Valera says in August 1921, after he's spoken to David Lloyd George and said there's no basis here for an agreement, he says, we are not doctrinaire Republicans. What was voted for in 1918, what formed the basis of the formation of the First Dáil, was a vote for freedom and for independence, but we are not Republican doctrinaires. So the question is there wriggle room? Yeah. And how much wriggle room is on the British side?
And to pick up from Diarmaid, we'll move on to the actual, you know, the dancing around during the summer. To the extent, does the truce represent exhaustion, or does it represent promise for the various parties, you know?
I suppose in some ways it's a bit of both, but I think that if we go back, even just to pick up on something that Diarmaid said there in relation to that question, I mean, Lloyd George has been involved thinking about Ireland. So if you think back to, he's been brought into the Irish Convention. This has been hanging around in his head since 1917 in that respect. This is something, as Diarmaid said, they want this off their plate. They want it off their plate for quite pragmatic reasons, and as Diarmaid said already. But I think we have to think of it, we don't really think of it as much as we might in the context of the realities of British politics, both on that island, but also much further afield. There's a sense in which, if you read, say, Henry Wilson's diaries, which he keeps meticulously night after night, which I don't know how he does, incredibly long entries, where he's effectively saying, I need 10,000 men on the Rhine, I have to get them out of Ireland. There's some very, very pragmatic reasons why the British need to get there. I think we also have to think of it in terms of the timing with Northern Ireland. Yeah. The fact that you've had the Northern Irish Parliament open on the 22nd of June after that point, and some have argued it's only after that point that you can get them to come and sit down and have a chat. Whether they're exhausted.
Would you agree with that reading, that the Ulster being settled by the Government of Ireland Act, at the very least, is a key enabler of looking to the options for dealing with the more troublesome issue, if not a precondition for it?
I think so. I mean, the timing is very, very interesting. The talks behind the scenes, even by the 24th of June, even 2 days after that has happened, are very interesting. So it's really quite striking that there is this move. It's a tricky move. So if you think from, say, Lloyd George's point of view, he's been saying for months, I'm not going to sit down with murderers. You know, he's been saying very, very publicly, giving this type of position on what's going on in Ireland. And I think he puts it at one stage in the context of, this would be like the Prime Minister of the day sitting down with the Phoenix Park murderers. How am I going to get the British public to accept that? He's very, very conscious of what is a parliament going to stand. How much are they going to take in terms of, can I actually sit down across the table from Michael Collins? And even the degree to which, when they get to London, what, do we shake their hands? How do we handle these people? And it's very interesting if you look at how the British press deal with Collins in particular in those few months. And even before this, you're getting this, not quite a softening of the treatment of Collins, but there's a sort of, he's becoming the Scarlet Pimpernel much more so than the most wanted man in Ireland. There's a degree to which the press are helping them out in terms of how do we make these people, if you like, acceptable to sit down and invite into Downing Street. And I suppose there's the pressure, I was kind of reminded when I was thinking about this, when you heard, I think it was supposedly Boris Johnson joking that the Daily Telegraph is his real boss. But it is striking that the Times, the Daily Mail are calling for peace in Ireland. So the degree to which pressure is coming from the British public to some extent, but also from those key elements of the British press, that's all feeding into this. We need this to stop.
You mentioned, Diarmaid, red lines. The summer of the truce, as it were, between July and October, when the delegate, we'll come to the delegates in a minute and how they were picked, but the actual, what had been clarified? I mean, when it was all over, Lloyd George said, we conceded nothing that wasn't on the table on our 20th of July memorandum when they set out the conditions. And if you look at De Valera's, again, it might explain De Valera's unease throughout the whole thing. De Valera's trip to Lloyd George and what it had clarified or not clarified. Reading the accounts of it and what came out from it.
They were both very agitated.
They were, but the thing that to go back to Anne's thing, just to pick it up, Lloyd George rather tellingly mentioned that he was relieved that De Valera did not raise Fermanagh and Tyrone in those discussions, because he would have been different. He was happy that De Valera was into the abstractions of sovereignty and crown and symbol and 800 years of oppression, and he was ready for the long haul lecture. But where the hand of cards was weak, he was pleased that De Valera hadn't raised them. Now, did De Valera, after those meetings, have any grounds for thinking that the British position on the key issues that had arisen within the empire rather than outside it, despite all the work afterwards on external relations, no coercion of Ulster, perhaps more wriggle room than was initially seen on defence and on navy and so on. And fiscal autonomy was never a break issue when it came down to it. So really, throughout the summer, was the basis of what could or could not be achieved substantially clear to all parties?
Broadly. There's a very vivid account of those initial meetings between David Lloyd George and De Valera in Frances Stevenson's diaries. She was the secretary and mistress to David Lloyd George for decades. Now, they're not gospel, obviously, but they do give us a fairly accurate depiction, I'd say, of some of the emotion that's swirling around as well, you know, and there's an agitation there. And obviously, you know, Lloyd George is determined to paint his broad brushstrokes, you know, in relation to the empire. But he brings up this interesting question about terminology, about a republic, you know, and a free state or a Saorstát or Fóblicht. Does that not just mean people, you know? He's trying to get him to elaborate, I suppose. De Valera is reluctant in a way to be drawn into explicit definitions, but he's getting nervous that he's given too much away, De Valera. And he comes back for a subsequent encounter within those couple of meetings, you know. You know, there has to be, I have to go back and be able to say that I stand by the vote of the people, the sovereignty of the people. This is not something that I can give away without consultation. But, you know, there's a trepidation there. And a nervousness, and there's a bit of shadowboxing going on. But in relation to whether the broad sketches are there, well, broadly you could say yes. But there's still an awful lot of detail that needs to be worked out. You know,
before we get to the detail, what about the delegates? You mentioned British politics, and I think you're right, very right, that the dynamics within the British political system in 1921. Remember, Lloyd George was gone within a year, and he was an indispensable genius, but without a real party base at all, presiding over. There's an odd irony, perhaps, the two of the most important actors relating to the final thing in the treaty weren't in the room at all, De Valera and Bonar Law. You know, the two whose bony fingers, as it were laying down what could or could not be conceded. But to go back to the delegation, the British delegation, we can say a word on. It had plenty of heavy hitters on it, obviously, and Lloyd George, with his immense experience at that stage of negotiation, European and otherwise, was really without equal. What about the Irish delegation that eventually went over? How it was selected, the key omissions, the dynamics, the coherence, the tensions? Well, what does it tell us about how many games were in play.
I mean, the big question is always the what if De Valera had gone? And, you know, I'm not sure how useful it is to pursue what ifs, but at the same time, I think De Valera doesn't go partly because he has been there already. Yeah. He's already sat down one-to-one with Lloyd George. It didn't go well, as you know, Diarmaid said. They do not like each other. And he, you know, I think he knows what's not available. I think, you know, there's about 15 communications between those two men after those 4 sit-down meetings together.
In August and sit-down,
I think De Valera refers to the word republic only twice.
That's right.
So I think he already knows this is not going to happen.
And he's working on his third way.
He's working as an external association. Now, the part of the problem by him not going, I think it's, on the one hand, if he had gone, arguably those discussions would have ended much, much earlier and not very well. But I think at the same time, by him not going, he sent the delegation off with this idea of external association without them really being fully clear what he meant by that. They were kind of waiting to hear back, well, what's the final like Griffiths finds himself in London trying to buy time to get more explanation as to what to work out external association a bit fuller. They're waiting for what the clause might be from the Irish position on Ulster. By the time, and if you like, the British delegation bring up Ulster first. They're in a very difficult position from that point of view, for a start. But, I mean, the people who do go, I mean, I think I'm always struck by, you know, this idea that Collins was sent because Collins was this figure that, you know, he stands for the IRA, he stands for all that has happened in a military sense. He's also there because he's a bloody Minister for Finance.
Yes.
And that's really, like, would any country send a delegation without the Minister for Finance? No. He's very much there because of that. He's the one who's on all the subcommittees, one of which is on finance. So, you know, I think we forget the dimensions of Collins very easily and very quickly there. I mean, you look at I think Frank Pakenham talks about it, it's a fairly impressive cohort if Winston Churchill is 4th on the team. Yeah. And like, you know, you're looking at someone like Birkenhead, who he completely outshines the legal, if you like, brains on the Irish delegation. So, you know, this is a very, very difficult situation they're going into.
But they also have Griffith, of course.
Yeah,
I mean, he's founder of Sinn Féin. Yeah. You know, De Valera would have made the argument, I've got a well-balanced team here. Yeah. I'll stay behind as the symbol of the Republic, uncontaminated by that scoundrel. I'll work on my third way. I'll try and convince the hardliners at home, like Cathal Brugha and Austin Stack. But then when you look at people like Robert Barton and Erskine Childers is detested in London. And there's a degree of distrust about him there. Is he De Valera's man over there? Is Barton? Are they there to push some other way? And you have legal expertise. They want legal expertise. You know, you have Gavin Duffy and you have Eamon Duggan. So they are thinking about the different areas. Okay, we want someone with legal expertise. We want someone with economic knowledge, which Robert Barton had. He had been Minister for Agriculture, the Dáil Minister. And then we have the two. And of course, one of them, Collins, is IRB, because we have to try and consider that as well, you know, because the Supreme Council of the IRB are going to become relevant as well.
Could I press you both on something that people trying to imagine this, and given that an awful lot of people come to history now through dramatizations and television and so on. But one of the things that arises is, what were these people like, their presence, the total presence of the one with the other? And put it this way, accents are an important factor here. And the way in which social class and experience and background either assisted or didn't assist. And if you look at the Irish delegation, Gavin Duffy, born in France, or educated exclusively in England. Barton, rugby, Christchurch, and the Royal Agricultural College.
Ex-First World War.
Yes, Royal Agricultural College, the inside place for the husbandry and gentlemen farmers, of which an alumnus is our current Minister for Foreign Affairs, of course. But if you look at that, and you look at John Chart, you look at Childers. You know, there's nobody there who's picked up in the front row of the Munster final in hurling to go over and to let them know what exactly Cork was thinking. Now, you may say Collins. Griffith is an experienced journalist and has done plenty of time in the trenches dealing with intransigent people. But he's not a senior negotiator who has ever had to deliver anything at all. So when you actually look at that, and then you look at, as you say, Churchill, Birkenhead, even the rather lugubrious Austin Chamberlain.
But I think as well you have to think about Childers had been, I think, a contemporary, was it at school with Lionel Curtis?
Yes.
So again, you have these connections in the Secretariat of both sides, which are really important. But Tom Jones is a really interesting figure in that respect.
Yes, yes.
Because again, there's someone from a working class background who had worked his way up to, go to university, had been a Barrington lecturer in Ireland. So again, that's used as a means to win over the Irish delegation. He uses his knowledge of Ireland. He travels up and down Ireland.
He probably had more experience of
we should
probably than
most of the delegation. Certainly the more
the Tom Jones Diaries. Tom Jones was the secretary to the cabinet. Like, Tom Jones Diaries are one of the most brilliant sources for this period because he recorded in such voluminous detail what was going on and the psychology of what was going on, which is partly what you're talking about.
It is, and he was a confidant of Lloyd George's in addition to the post he held.
Yeah, absolutely.
There were two Welshmen who had a good sense of provincial Welsh on the make.
But he also he
he
communicates the human dilemmas, and it's also relevant to what you're saying about they're looking for the weak links. Where are the weak links here? Who can we isolate? Obviously, Arthur Griffith is not considered to be one of the more militant. So can we work on him? And he's regarded as more moderate anyway. He had been detected as more moderate at a much earlier stage. But I think more importantly, maybe in the long run, is had they worked out their bottom line before they went over?
Yes.
And that's crucial.
Yeah.
Because, you could say the British negotiation team, I mean, even though there's a balancing act for David Lloyd George and his government there and the negotiators, they're quite firm and quite clear about more than the Irish side are.
Yeah.
They don't have their Ulster policy worked out before they go over.
No,
they're still waiting on it. And in a sense, you get both a London Sinn Féin and a Dublin Sinn Féin as a result of the treaty because the tension, and at one stage, they have to say to De Valera, you have to stop interfering.
Yes.
You're further complicating our dilemmas here.
Yeah.
And, they even mentioned the possibility of him coming over. So a lot of tensions develop. And internally, the delegates become divided.
Yes. Well, I was going to say a bit. We'll talk about the actual the dynamics of the thing, as it were, in a moment. Just on that score, how clear they were on the instructions. Now, to do devil's advocate on the De Valera side, De Valera's position and the Pakenham reading as well was that they were given fairly clear instructions on what they were to break on and this and that. Chart was given the responsibility effectively. He was another very evangelical Irish nationalist from an English background. He'd been in intelligence in the Department of Munitions. He was given the task essentially of working out the early draft of what might be on the external association, the one that to be associated with the Commonwealth or Empire, but not to be in it. But what was interesting is that they weren't a cohesive team from the very beginning. They were staying in different places. Collins didn't stay with the rest of them. At a very early stage, the British realised that the way to make progress was not to have plenary sessions in which they were all in the room marking each other, in which the gimlet-eyed Childers was keeping them all on cue, as it were, but to break up into sub-sessions and keep Childers outside the door. So that from the point of view of how the thing was actually conducted, there was a very clear management of the steps through which difficulties were to be worked around and the target issues were to be identified in sequence. And one would have to say that the Irish were outmanoeuvred fairly considerably, maybe because they wanted to be.
Well, they had 7 meetings. They had 7 initial meetings where they're all together. And then they break up, as you say, into these individual meetings. And I think it's even striking, even from the very outset, the Irish delegation asked, can we have a stenographer? And they're told, no, you can take longhand notes. That in and of itself kind of disrupts the, God, are we going to get all the notes down? They're on the back foot. They're the ones out of their comfort area. Like, they have to come back and forward on the mailboat if they need to.
And that's
get information
exhaustion.
home.
And drink and late nights and that stuff. The idea, you don't hop back to Dublin from London in those days. It's a grueling journey. And those factors are...
But you're right though as well about the dynamics within the cohort that go, because if you think about it, what De Valera had come home with earlier on, the kind of early, ideas that are put forward from London, the people who are more likely to agree with those ideas are the ones that are getting sent off the cabinet. So Collins, Griffith, Mulcahy's keen on those kind of ideas. So there's a degree of sort of it's very clear that the more moderate people are in London, the more extreme people are at home. But equally within, as you say, that cohort to go to London, that sense of Griffith not trusting Childers, Collins coming a couple of days after the rest of the delegation, as you say, the sense of anticipation in London to finally see him, and then the main body of the delegation, and then he's not bloody there, and people, but it's Collins's name they're shouting out for. That's causing tension.
Yeah, it might be no harm before we move on, to note at least that some of these delegates had fairly lengthy experience going back to 1920 of tic-tacking closely with the castle officials in Dublin who were briefing Anderson, Jimmy Cope, Sturgis, and in other words, the Dublin Castle team, more particularly the Dublin Castle team that you would see as being for a settlement rather than for a continuation of the war, they were briefing the London side on everything, including the calibre and the break points of everybody they were going to meet. So they had their cards marked, doubly, as it were, from those. And I think the stuff that has survived from the Dublin Castle gives an idea, not always accurately, mind you, they had their own prejudices. But they made a good estimate of the calibre of most of the Irish they were going to have to deal with. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I mean, that was one of the reasons why they wanted to talk to Griffith at an earlier stage. I mean, C.J. Phillips, who was attached to the Foreign Office, was involved in kind of tentative moves towards opening up some kind of dialogue. You know, he referred to a kind of a slender link that had been established when Arthur Griffith was in jail, and they're being careful about identifying particular Sinn Féiners as people they could do business with. Moderate Sinn Féiners. And this question, of course, it explodes in many respects in the aftermath of the signing. Well, you know, what does that mean in the context of Sinn Féin? You know, how many moderates are there in Sinn Féin? And is it just a question of there being moderates and diehards? You know, are there others in between, which obviously becomes relevant in the treaty debates? But you're absolutely right. They're onto that at an earlier stage. And there's a copious amount of documentation, particularly from Alfred Cope and people like that, who, you know, remain players in Anglo-Irish affairs even after the treaty is signed during that transition period, because they become very interested then in whether this can be, you know, bedded down. So they're an important part of it. Maybe we neglect them sometimes. But you also have to, I suppose, consider the knowledge that the Irish delegates had about expectations. Because the coverage at home, you know, the expectation, the newspapers, it's not just in Britain, it's also in Ireland, you know. And people are getting used to the absence of violence. So there's an awful lot of emotion sloshing around these things as well, you know.
Could I raise two tricky ones just, and we'll see if we can get an opinion on them at least. One of them is, because it goes right to the end, the two letters, the famous dramatic or melodramatic moment in which Lloyd George said, you either sign, or I have two letters here to send to Sir James Craig. One of them says we have an agreement, the other says we'll have war, and so on, and the theatricality of it, which goes on the night trade. So that's the first one. Who was prepared for war, actually, or was there a degree of bravado? And the second one, I suppose, is the one that we have mentioned twice already, but let's just get stuck in it. Was Ulster at play at any stage in these discussions? In other words, once Bonar Law had laid it down, that the sine qua non for any settlement with this crowd, you can give them anything on tariffs even, you can give them what you like, you know, home rule or dominion state as well, but no touching Ulster. And Craig knew he had that in the bank. Bonar Law, even after he retired from leadership of the Conservative Party because of illness, he came back again. But he was he was really the key figure whose veto mattered. Was Ulster ever at play, other than through Lloyd George's ingenious suggestion of the Boundary Commission?
I mean, it's really tricky because, I mean, it's the one thing Pakenham says, Ulster is this awkward thing from the beginning. He doesn't quite know what to do with it when he writes about it. And it's there all the time. It keeps kind of coming up. When you look at the treaty itself, most of the 18 clauses, an incredibly short document when you think about it, but most of the clauses refer to it in some shape or form. So it's
but they refer to it clearly, leaving with it the absolute right to opt out of everything.
But it's back to something you said earlier, though, that this is the place where the British delegation know they're at their weakest. And the moment they can get that assurance from Griffith
That he won't.
That he won't
break
bring
on Ulster.
he won't break on Ulster, which is the direction they've been given. If it's going to break on Ulster. Once they get that assurance, you can, in a way, you can see the burden lift off Lloyd George.
But it is in play to the extent that they have to reach that point, and how they reach that point, it is in play to a degree. But the caveat, which has been articulated very forcefully by David Lloyd George, even before the negotiations, we're not forcing Ulster.
No.
There's not going to be any force. We can discuss the idea of essential unity, and then he speaks out of both sides of his mouth, three sides of his mouth at some stage. And Craig is, of course, obdurate, is not going to budge, and why would he? He had what he wanted, and he was going to hold it. But at the same time, there are attempts to try and budge him. They're not quite wholehearted.
No, but I mean,
the idea
they find him infuriating.
The idea of essential unity.
They find him infuriating. He's a most unsympathetic character. Lloyd George is at times close to being.
They reserve some of their
said all of that,
greatest scorn.
It never reaches the point at which there's going to be even leverage, not to mind coercion. When there wasn't coercion in 1912, there wasn't going to be coercion in December of 1921.
But De Valera's already agreed that he's not going to force
exactly.
either. So that's a really key kind of admission as well. So that's already been said.
But the Boundary Commission was a very clever negotiating strategy.
Well, Lloyd George, you see, from the continental negotiations that he had gone through. And even in the course of the Irish discussions, he was toing and froing on Silesia. He was toing and froing on several border disputes and disputes that were of the exact same kind, interethnic and liminal issues of territory.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's important to remember the constant interruptions. These are not linear negotiations. There isn't this sustained focus. They are breaking off because of other urgent matters.
Yeah, indeed.
Other matters that are deemed to be sometimes much more important than Ireland.
But in a way, that's maybe one of the places where the Irish delegation is an advantage. They're there. This is their sole purpose. The British, as you say, the British delegation are doing all these other things. They're going back to they're going back to their other jobs.
Yes. You mentioned something there, and it might be no harm just to hop on it for a second before we look to the actual moment of signature and the tricky question why it wasn't referred back and why nobody picked up a telephone to De Valera in Limerick with the O'Maras. But what's interesting about some of the dramatis personae of this is how much they both personally and through family harked back to the Parnellite days of the 1880s. Churchill, the father, Arthur Balfour is still around. Chamberlain, weak but nevertheless the son of Radical Joe, who had broken with Gladstone and broken his career effectively on Ireland. Every time that Gladstone is looking for a precedent in which, Lloyd George is looking for a precedent in which to bat off De Valera, he either sends somebody looking for Lecky, or he reads Barry O'Brien's Life of Parnell, or he cites Gladstone. Gladstone said this in 1886. Gladstone said this in 1893. We talk about the Irish being obsessed with historical reference. These guys had historical reference and precedent, both interfamily, generational, and the quotations at their fingertips from the 1880s, certainly, and in some cases longer.
And it's that reference that is specifically made to Ireland being the fatal influence on British politics, which harks back to that earlier period. You're talking about over 40 years.
You are.
And you're absolutely right. And one of the...
Balfour's still there.
One of the attractions of trying to finally resolve this is to take that out of party politics. We've enough to be dealing with. I don't think David Lloyd George is as ideologically connected maybe to that way of thinking than some of the other people.
No, though he was a disciple of Tam Ellis.
Yeah, and he's also, he said it himself, that he had ended up in the Irish bog, much to his disgust at an earlier stage, and even, coming over after 1916.
But it's interesting, though, they do sort of say, though, that, and I think Chamberlain says, like, no... You're not, and it's interesting they say no Englishman is going to go and die for to save Fermanagh and Tyrone.
That's right.
And all
They'll die for empire, but not for that.
A couple of them say things like that.
Yes.
So it's interesting how yes, they do have those ties.
Yes.
But when you look at someone like Chamberlain and Birkenhead, they have moved a hell of a distance.
Yes.
And of course, they're also very conscious of the Home Rule crisis and how it engulfed
their whole families, their whole generation before. Come to the know of it. Why did they not ring De Valera? Why did they sign without referring back?
because they were fed up with him. I'd say, I mean, they had gone back now. On the 2nd of December, they returned for a discussion with the Cabinet, which was a very difficult affair. And of course, the question always remained, this is an issue from the beginning. What are their exact instructions? Do they have the power to negotiate and conclude, as would be suggested by their formal title, plenipotentiaries? They were appointed by the Dáil, but they also have instructions to the Cabinet that they have to refer any agreement back before signing, which in a way are, they're contradictory in instructions, and that's an issue in itself. But obviously, the question arose, why didn't you not make a final consultation? Because you were told before concluding that you should. And the answer is probably that they would have, particularly bearing in mind that they're being threatened with immediate and terrible war in 3 days, which is very dramatic.
It is, yeah.
Are they in a position to call his bluff? Did they have a moral duty to sign, as the historian Leland Lyons later suggested? Or do you ring back to be told by De Valera, you can't sign that?
Yes, indeed.
And then Lloyd George says, okay. It's a resumption of war.
Yes.
And again, going back to the other questions, we were talking about expectations and taking the responsibility for that decision. And it's not, obviously, it's not taken lightly. Griffith said he would sign even if the others wouldn't sign, which was an indication too of the way the dynamics had worked and the isolation that had gone on. But I mean, that's the essential dilemma. Do you ring back for another barren discussion? I mean, they know what the response is going to be.
No, when you get Collins into the treaty debates, he says, if you don't take this, your policy is war. That's it. There's nothing else on the table, and it comes up again and again when De Valera introduces document 2 as this alternative to the treaty. And I think somebody has to stand up and say, sorry, this isn't you don't pick the one you like.
Yes.
There's one on the table that they have. That they have.
And I always ask students.
That's it.
I always ask students, and it's a stupid question to ask them really, but sure you have to. Would you have signed? 9 out of 10 of them say yes. Now, why is it a stupid question? Because they know what happened afterwards, But at the same time, they're trying to grapple with the idea of the enormity of the responsibility. But most of them would say that they would have signed.
Well, it's that kind of question is a hallowed one.
Absolutely.
Diarmaid for classes. Cruz O'Brien said that when he asked any class what side would they have been on in the Parnellite split. To a man, they were all Parnellites. But one suspects the way Cruiser put the question didn't leave them much options. Now, could I go on? Because I'm mindful of the clock. The debate itself, and so on. Just a number of things to remember. The Dáil that debated this, leave out the IRB councils and all of the other different groups, even the Army Council, though all of these are key players in it. But just for the moment on the Dáil, because this perhaps gets overlooked. This Dáil was a nominated Dáil. People forget that the second Dáil, they were all elected, they were all returned unelected, having been nominated in 1920. So that there was a lot of greenhorns. There were some people that were sharp and so others, but there were some who were looking for leadership and who hadn't been following things closely. But they were suddenly landed with this extraordinary thing where loyalties to particular leaders or different groups and so on congealed very quickly. That's number one, the actual speeches. The second one, how very little there was on Ulster, because either they were more than happy to take the reassurance that the Boundary Commission would work, or because to go near it otherwise would have been just too difficult, apart from the Monaghan TDs, Blythe and McEntee as well. And the third one, of course, is the women. Now, they were very particular women, the 6 women who were in that second Dáil. But their stance and the rhetoric of Mary McSweeney, there are 3 elements of that Dáil debate on the treaty that stand out. What the Dáil was about, in other words, what kind of a Dáil it was, the absence of division on Ulster and the huge amount of time spent on the oath and kind of the essentially thing, the almost sanctified thing. And lastly, the women as the particular voice of particular women. Would I pick up that just or any of them, all or any?
So even before getting into those 3 things, I suppose if you think about it, this relatively short couple of pieces of paper come back. And in a way, these people who have been, since 1917, I suppose, if you think of it, that moment when in a way De Valera becomes this joining of the 2 wings, the military and political wings. From that moment on, it's been all vague. It's been these big words. We want independence, we want freedom, we want a republic. And in a way, here's a bit of paper that says, well, what do you mean by those words? Are you with it? Is this enough or is this not enough? And in a way, that decision isn't enormous. Or the fact that people haven't been pushed to a point, and even as we spoke earlier, the fact that the delegation are going over not fully clear as to what does he mean by external association. These two circles that touch but don't sort of cross. That moment of these people are sitting there going, can I stomach this or not?
Yeah.
Can I stomach this oath or not? And I think that is an enormous part of that decision they have to make. For the first time, they really have to make the decision. What do I actually mean by freedom? What do I mean by these massive words that they've bandied about relatively freely up to this point? And now they have to make that choice. But you're right, this is a cohort of people who, I think Ronan Fanning always used to make that point, this is a cohort of people who in a way are not necessarily fully representative of the people who are sitting at home, getting the newspapers and worrying what's going to happen as a result of this debate. I mean, the question of the 6 women, and I mean, again, they're dismissed as the 6 women who are there because they are someone's relative. That's not the full case. Ada English of this parish. That is not the case with her.
She was remarkable.
She is. And you know, again, she's under
Kate
her...
Callaghan would have been in any assembly anywhere.
So I think we've...
These are remarkably learned people. They're very well educated, they're very well read, and they do point that out. Mary McSweeney does too, because
They're all anti-treaty.
Yeah, they're all anti-treaty, but I mean, this is the interesting thing about the broader, the broader feelings around what they had been through. Some of the women have specific things to say about how they've been affected personally, and no, these are not experienced politicians. But there are 121 TDs who deliberate and vote on this treaty. We can't reduce their arguments to just one side or the other, or one box or the other. They're actually quite impressive. They're intelligent people, you know. They're not experienced politicians, but what they do have is a depth of feeling, as you say, and sincerity about the positions that they hold. And they can articulate that, some of them, marvellously well. In the case of Mary McSweeney, to her, it's not a question of peace or war, it's a question of right or wrong. But it's also about this idea of the Republic as a living faith. And we can't dismiss that because they felt it so deeply. And she spoke for so long about that. And obviously, the keeper of her brother's flame is, but that's only one part of her, you know. But the others, and the men, and the substance of what they're dealing with, for some, the oath can be stomached because it's not really, as they see it, a direct oath of allegiance to a British.
But they're also thinking of it. Certainly, Collins is thinking of it. Particularly that last change they get made. You know, it's first and foremost an oath of fidelity.
Yes, to the.
You know, your allegiance is first to the Constitution, and then you are going to be faithful. So it's with the expectation again. Maybe a little bit like Lloyd George. He too is sort of, I'm going to get this through, and then I'll work on the Constitution. We'll write a Constitution that doesn't mention the King. You know, it's all the time. I'm going to get this step, and then I get the next step. But
now I'm going to call a halt because I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, and I want to leave some time for questions. But before that, just 2 things that we might just have a brief word on. We know that the debate itself was the vote was tight, and effectively, but the treaty was passed by the Dáil, and then subsequently public opinion in the elections and so on, and the overwhelming, if you like, opinion of the establishment, you know, the hierarchy, the newspapers, and so on, that part. So we know that the treaty was accepted, and we know that the division that came out in the Dáil effectively poisoned everything afterwards for the Civil War. But 2 things that occurred that we might just say a quick word on. One is treaties generally that were reached after the end of the First World War. There were a large number of treaties that were reached, that were arrived at through the victor powers forcing treaties, and treaties that were terms that were accepted under protest or seen to have been established under duress. There was hardly a part from the Baltic to the Balkans in which there weren't groups who were effectively treaty revisionists of some kind or another, going back to the Bolsheviks after Brest-Litovsk, on right through to the Balkans and so on. In most cases, they were the aggrieved parties because they had been excluded from the treaty and were simply told, this is it. Now, in the case of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which is it's an unusual one in that sense, that it is a treaty that is agreed, albeit under duress or with the threat of the 2 envelopes. But what's remarkable is that how absolutely carefully to its terms the parties and particularly the aggrieved party, if you like, that is to say the Free State, was in the 1920s. And even when the most ardent revisionists come in Fianna Fáil de Valera in the 1930s, they still by and large dismantled it by the rules rather than through direct repudiation. So in that sense, it's a very unusual treaty of the European treaties from the spring of 1918 through to 1924. That's the one. And the second one is the historiography of it, or the commemoration of it, Diarmaid. After 50 years, 1971, a couple of good publications, yes, but how did the state mark the 50th?
It didn't, and that really... that led to a lot of tension. There's a particularly emotional exchange, actually, between Richie Ryan, of all people, you know, who would not have been regarded as a particular carrier of the Civil War wounds. But he refers to the pygmy-minded pettiness of the Taoiseach at the time, Jack Lynch, because the state was not commemorating it. Fine Gael, it was a Fine Gael commemoration. But even in 1946, for the 25th anniversary, it was a Fine Gael commemoration. They had a meeting in the Mansion House, and they spoke, Richard Mulcahy spoke glowingly about how Ireland had won back its purse, and that what the treaty was about was sovereignty for Ireland in peace and war. And of course, the context there is Irish neutrality. So they did mark it in that way. Leland Lyons, of course, wrote quite famously about it.
3 essays.
That was the 50th anniversary, and it's also, he refers to the dire past overhanging the dire present, because it was the outbreak.
He was writing in a very lugubrious mood.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that was the time the North was already, and that was the same year that his Ireland since the famine was published.
And he's warning people not to become prisoners of ideology, and in that way he's praising those who, as he saw it, had the courage.
So it is interesting, Anne, that's the year also in which Tom Jones' diary was published. The Keith Middlemis's edition was 1971. It coincided with it, but it opened it out. To go back to the point that Diarmaid has made just a minute. 1946 and 1971. One could argue that in 1946, all right, there had been a long period of the shutters pulled during the war and so on, but there was still unfinished business. And to a degree, when Costello did the Republic in Canada and so on, that finished one particular evolution of the treaty's potential. Okay? 1971, difficult to start talking about it as finished business when what was happening in Northern Ireland in 1971. So to a degree, no more than the problem that the Ulster Unionists had with anniversaries of partition falling in the middle of turmoil and worse. They were not the most propitious dates to be commemorating things.
Absolutely.
No. And it's too awkward. I mean, it causes such... It's seen as this is the moment when the split happens, when you get... This is the cause of the Civil War. This easy, I suppose, this piece of paper leads to Civil War. And it can't be... It can't be detached from that.
The idea that a Fianna Fáil government was ever going to spearhead a commemoration.
No.
I mean, the very idea was that I think Brian Lenihan Jr. was the first Fianna Fáiler to
go to
get
bail and law. Exactly.
The fact
in
that
2010.
it took that long to do something like that, you know, I think it's too difficult.
And just the last thing I know, I mean, Anne, you may have addressed this before about that question of all the other peace treaties and I suppose the stability of the Irish one. Is part of it about that different experience of the First World War? That, you know, Ireland is not coming out of that with that devastating defeat for itself in a way that other countries are.
No, but it also succeeds in wresting a treaty from a victor power in a way that is not common at the time.
But I think at the same time we still look at it, and understandably so, from a very Irish perspective. And I think we underestimate the degree to which defence is a key part of the treaty. The defence and the role of the Crown. And I think you even see that in 1932 when you get an Irish Situation Committee again. You get this wonderful document in London where they're kind of going, bloody hell, De Valera is in government. He's going to dismantle the treaty. What do we do? He's going to remove the oath. And they reformed this committee. The first time they've had an Irish Situation Committee since the War of Independence. And you can see there just how important the oath was to them. And I think we have underestimated the importance
and how important it was to the English in particular. Could I stop there? We have a few moments for some questions, if there are questions, and this obviously is a conversation that will continue. We're not going to try and put a definitive answer. Yes, please.
Very interesting talk. I'd just like to know, is this the first time that we know, or don't know, about the Catholic Church's role? Did they have a role, or did they just shut up?
They didn't shut up for very long. No, I mean, there is a muteness on the part of the church. I mean, in many respects during the War of Independence, that they haven't been driving their flocks the way they might like. They've been reacting. There are exceptions. I don't want to make sweeping generalizations about the Catholic Church, but the church does become, the leadership of the Catholic Church becomes very pro-treaty. They are very silent about the executions during the Civil War. They do argue, many of them, in favour of the treaty on the grounds, like a bit like business interests. I mean, there's this phrase, the moral interests are in favour of the treaty, because they want to return to peace, they want normality, they want businesses to resume. And the church, of course, wants to have a very strong influence moving into that vacuum that's there as a result of the divide over the treaty. Whatever divides us, we have our ancestral faith in common. And with the creation of a new free state, over 90% of the population of that southern state is Catholic. So they're in a very advantageous position. But I would also argue that they're deeply insecure during this period because of the volatility. And they come to realise what Irish people can do to each other despite the ferocity of their faith. And that makes them resort to very gloomy pronouncements during the 1920s about the Irish and about the capacity for sin. So it's a very complicated relationship they have with that period.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
No.
I mean, I think the other thing is that's interesting. I don't know. It's not something that we mentioned, but the anti-treatyites are keen to have a vote on the treaty before Christmas. They don't want a Christmas break, and I'm never sure to what extent are they worried about. On the one hand, they're worried about the TDs going home, getting the opinion of their constituents, but are they also worried about going home and getting the opinions of the local parish priests?
Yeah.
And it's striking. I think, as Diarmaid said, the pastoral letter and all the rest of it when we get into the executions, but Cosgrave also sent out a letter to every doctor, every parish priest, again, effectively encourage your parishioners to do the right thing and recognise
goes the pillars of the community.
Exactly, the will of the people. Yes. And this assumption that the parish priest is going to be of that persuasion. And I suppose Patrick Murray his book is fascinating. The Oracles of God, it's called. But it looks at that, just the differences of opinion within the Catholic Church. They don't all speak with one voice on this either.
Except there is the underlying anxiety that the protracted period of lawlessness has brought the society to the edge of a precipice of order and of good behaviour. And that whatever they might feel about the different constitutional positions, the main issue was that the country couldn't be allowed to lapse.
And we need
the
more
young generation couldn't be allowed to lapse.
We need more schmacht over our wild women.
That's exactly. Now, have anybody else that would have a question? Cadê? Yes? We can hear certainly anyway. Oh, sorry, Malishgal. You're right, you're correct.
My father was 11 when that treaty was signed, and he always said to me that his father was convinced that there was a lack of management of communications and PR at home, and that exacerbated the divide when the treaty was signed. And he always thought that Collins didn't really want to go there, although he had to because he was Minister for Finance. And he never felt that they would achieve any more than that. But he always felt that there was an absence of good management of messaging within Ireland to create an expectation of what was achievable. And that divide created the split, which was horrendous in terms of how families broke up. And for years later, people wouldn't even talk to each other. So just a comment on that, on that management of communication and what people should have expected from that negotiation.
It's a very fair point. I mean, I think the Collins says it in the debates very clearly. That if by sending us to London, that's when the compromise is made, and in a way, that's when I suppose the preparation, the ground should have been prepared maybe more effectively at home for something less than a republic potentially coming back. It's interesting, De Valera makes quite a couple of interesting sort of statements after he comes back from London. This whole thing, I think you mentioned it earlier, I'm not a doctrinaire Republican. That's a very interesting thing for him to have said at that point. that we always said that we decide in the former government once we got our independence. So you could argue that those kind of statements were making some kind of attempt, but I think at the same time you're right, there isn't.
But there's also the question, and it was raised at various stages afterwards, and you mentioned it about maybe the gulf between the TDs and the people they supposedly represent. How many of the people they represent are consumed by theories? You know, De Valera, David Lloyd George has given out about De Valera in July about his obsession with theories and formulae. Like, they're hugely important in relation to the management of politics and solutions. But for people who are concerned about the future, they're not necessarily guided by those things. I tell you who do manage their message very well are newspaper proprietors and editors, because they're not ambiguous, most of them.
And they were cultivated, Diarmaid. They were cultivated.
They were, absolutely. And I mean, it's a different era for the press. But when you read their editorials, you know, they're quite emphatic, and they're broadly pro-treaty. That messaging, that's another way for messaging to be managed. You know, and of course we're dealing with an era where there's, you know, there are a lot of people reading a lot of newspapers, including local newspapers. So they do play an important role. But it's difficult to convince people that certain things are worth fighting over to this extent.
But there's kind of two things as well. Like the papers at the same time, it's really interesting. When you look at the papers around the time the debates are going on, there's lots about Northern Ireland, how violent Northern Ireland was at that point. But yet, the people in the chamber discussing this treaty, that's not filtering through into them. So in a way, there's this, sometimes it's really interesting.
And they're already partitioned.
But I was going to, they had concerns, but they didn't have an answer.
I mean,
exactly.
You asked the question earlier about the neglect of the question of Ulster and Northern Ireland, the new Northern Ireland in the treaty debates. It's partly because it had been neglected anyway. You know, I mean, they had a kind of a theoretical attachment, but they haven't really evolved in their thinking about how you deal with that. And the more important issue for them is the sovereignty of the state that they're inhabiting.
But I'm going to have to guillotine because we're just a little over time, and as I suspected, conversations like this are not going to be one session or one as it were debate. We're going to have to continue these, and hopefully there will be plenty of opportunities before the end of the year. I just picked up something that I had, a point that Anne made just a moment ago, and Diarmaid was making it earlier as well, about the British side being so clear about the Crown, as equally obsessed with it as we were on the other, as the De Valera's were on the other side. And there's here the question at issue. This was Lloyd George when he eventually summoned Collins and Griffith just before the attack of the Four Courts in 22. And he said, the question at issue is a question between republican and monarchical institutions. Acts of the state in Ireland must run in the name of the Crown. That was the monarchy in Britain, in the British Commonwealth. The Crown was a mystic term, which, as they well know, that's to say Collins and Griffith, in the British Commonwealth simply stood for the power of the people. It is the mystic embodiment of the power of the people, and therefore it could not be removed as the ultimate source of legitimacy and of popular will. And that was their understanding of it every bit as thoroughly.
That could have been Mary McSweeney.
It could, on the other side, exactly, the exact same. Now, folks, firstly, thank you very much for coming. And as Katrina said at the start of the session, it was an absolute joy to have real people alive and alert and engaged in front of us for a conversation instead of talking into a small green light at the top of a small little square. Secondly, I want to thank Diarmaid and Anne. I need say nothing about how much distinguished historians of their generation are doing in terms of primary research and publications. They are an adornment on the profession, and they are a great treasure in Ireland today. And those of us who have been through it, as it were, admire them hugely and thank them for their new work all the time and their continuing excitement in new sources and new questions without, as they say, fear or favour. Go raibh míle maith go bhfuir fad agus slán bhaile.